Welcome, everyone. I'm thrilled to have you here for this exciting webinar. Today, we're unveiling the new and improved Fiscal 50. This is a special moment for me. I was a part of a team that launched the original Fiscal 50, so this is really close to my heart. Over the years, I've seen firsthand how crucial strong state budgets are for supporting our communities and improving lives. Budgets are the foundation for how states invest in economic growth and health outcomes. When we started, our goal was clear: to provide reliable indicators to help policymakers think long-term and strategically. Pew strives to develop and share data and insights that are clear, free of bias, and accessible to all users. And over this past decade, I'm so proud that Fiscal 50 has become a trusted resource grounding state budget debates in solid facts. It's cited hundreds of times in media and in policy discussions, and even made its way to a Supreme Court decision. The new Fiscal 50 is the next step in helping states to build resilient budgets. We continue to provide reliable data and insights, but we're also expanding our efforts with technical assistance and research. We've influenced state policies on everything from rainy day funds to budget stress testing. The updated Fiscal 50 offers the best data and insights for each state. It also looks ahead at new challenges like aging populations, new technologies, and natural disasters. I'm so proud to share the new Fiscal 50 with you. I hope you'll find it interesting, informative, and useful. Now let's watch a video featuring my friend and project director, Melissa Maynard, to see the new platform in action.
We are thrilled to share the new Fiscal 50 with you. We've added a whole host of exciting new features, and in doing so, we've taken care to remain true to Fiscal 50's signature approach. In the decades since our original launch, the feedback from users has been clear and consistent. You appreciate that we don't just throw a mountain of data at you and say, "Good luck figuring it all out." Instead, we make careful choices about what we present and then go to great lengths to help you make sense of it. The new Fiscal 50 takes this a step further by personalizing the experience. We can now guide you through the information in a way that responds to your location and interests. My goal today is to walk you through some of the features that we are most excited about so that you'll be sure not to miss them as you explore. From the menu at the top, you can navigate across the site and access our data and insights from a few different vantage points. This second dropdown is where you'll be able to find our new state pages. We recognize that many of you come to fiscal and demographic issues with your state as the lens and your peer states, neighbors, and national benchmarks as essential context. For that reason, these new state pages bring together all of Pew's key findings about your state in a way that cuts right to the chase. They also serve as a base camp of sorts for exploring what Pew's data and research means for your state. So we hope that you'll bookmark them and return often for updates. Let's explore the Kentucky page as an example. The summary at the top captures the big picture of your state's revenue structure. It draws from two of our popular, annually updated 50-state data visualizations, which you can click through to explore. These interactive stacked bar charts explain where each state's revenue comes from. So, for example, you can explore what role federal funds or sales taxes play and how that compares to other states. Moving down the page, we have a snapshot of each of our 8 indicators that will give you a quick feel for where your state stands and how it compares to regional and national benchmarks. Each indicator is designed to provide policy-relevant insights about states' fiscal resilience and will be updated once or twice a year depending on the topic as new data becomes available. The black dot here represents your state, and the clustering of the dots reflects the distribution of the data across other states. It's an illuminating way to look at this information because you can quickly get a sense of how your state aligns with or deviates from what we are seeing nationally. As you can see here, Kentucky's performance lines up reasonably well with what's happening in the South and nationally on indicators like fiscal balance and tax revenue trends. But it stands out a bit more on reserves and balances and long-term liabilities. We hope that these snapshots will engage your curiosity. You can click on the arrows below each dot plot to expand and collapse captions with more details about what the indicators signify. You can also hover over the dots to explore how other states are faring. If another state really captures your interest, you can click through to that state's page to get a better feel for its current dynamics. So here, you might double-click on this dot to better understand why total tax collections in California were 16.2% lower than the state's 15-year trend. So now we're on the California page, and you could then look to other indicators for context and see that California's reserves are above the national median, but it also has quite volatile tax revenue. And then to learn even more, you could click through to the tax revenue trends indicator page. And there, you could dive into the specifics of tax revenue trends nationally and in California. On this tax revenue trends page, you'll see a new summary at the top that explains what the indicator measures and why. And then over to the right, a clickable menu of the content, starting with state highlights. You'll see we note near the top that California's sharp drop was partially due to a deferral of the April income tax filing deadline until November in response to severe winter storms, an important piece of the puzzle that would be missed if you focused on the numbers alone. And then you could also use the interactive graphics to explore how California's tax revenue collections have deviated from their long-term trends by revenue stream. In this view, you can begin by looking at the overall national picture, and then you can use the drop-down menu to take a closer look at specific states and revenue streams. So sure enough, you can see that in California, it looks like sales tax collections were still above trend. But the same cannot be said for personal income tax collections, which were 31.7% below their long-term trend as of the second quarter of 2023. Another new feature we've included throughout the interactive platform are captions that respond to your selections. So you'll notice here that if you select California and personal income as we have, you'll find more details and context. In this case, we note that 25 of the other states that collect personal income taxes were also underperforming their long-term trends during this period. We've added new views and dimensions across the indicators. As another example, our population change indicator measures the difference between all new residents, including both births and newcomers from other states and abroad, and residents who have died or moved away. We've layered onto that a deeper exploration of the drivers of population change and how they are shaping states' demographic trajectories. In this map view, you can use the toggles to zoom in on natural change from births and deaths, and net migration over the long term and annually. You can use the blue slider to get a feel for historical patterns. This bar chart allows you to look at the data by region by selecting Show Region on the right hand of the side of the chart, or with custom state selections by using the blue drop-down menu. Here, too, you can choose to focus on long-term or one-year growth. Skipping down the page a bit, this tile map shows actual and projected population growth from 2000 to 2040 overall and by age group, and the analysis dives into what these trends might mean for states' fiscal health. For example, by moving the slider to select Growth by Age Group, you can populate a menu that allows you to explore what the working age population of 25 to 64-year-olds is likely to look like in the coming decades and compare your state to the national breakdown. And again, a caption customized to your selection provides key insights about the data. And finally, we've also provided an updated way for you to collect and share our data and graphics. The icon at the top right of each graphic gives you three options. You can download the data, copy the link with your selection so that you can share the exact view you are looking at, save a high-quality image file that also preserves your selections. And by the way, we encourage you to use these images in presentations on social media or even in other publications. Our signature indicators have always been at the heart of Fiscal 50, and we are really excited to share these enhancements with you. And we're eager to hear your thoughts and suggestions about how we can continue to improve. Returning now to our base camp at the California State page and continuing to scroll down, you'll find our Policy Tools section. This is where you can see how all of Pew's fiscal work comes together. This Policy Tools section will be updated over time and highlights Pew's most recent data and recommendations on practices related to improving fiscal sustainability. So, you can use these drop-down menus to see that Pew recommends that states conduct regular budget stress tests and that California is among 13 states leading in this regard. If you want to learn more, you can click through for a fact sheet specific to California and related research. And finally, you'll see our most recent content in a way that elevates the most relevant information. The titles, descriptions, and graphics here highlight key takeaways for your state. The last major update I want to share with you is a new regular feature called Budget Threads that we are really excited about. You can find it by clicking on the Overview button at the top of the page. The Overview page itself provides a national view of Pew's fiscal work, and it's anchored by this new Budget Threads feature. So what is Budget Threads? It's Pew's take on timely, interesting, and trending state budget news. These pieces aim to highlight and add context to economic and policy developments that matter for states' long-term fiscal health. Recently, we've looked at rising property taxes in the Mountain West and budget shortfalls that have been emerging as tax revenue trends descend from recent highs. We hope these pieces will fuel important conversations about the long-term implications of unfolding developments. And we really hope you will reach out with ideas for future Budget Threads pieces that relate to what you're seeing or experiencing in your state or are just curious about. And as with all of our content, you are more than welcome to share and republish these pieces. We hope that you will find the new Fiscal 50 to be a powerful resource for your work. Please take a moment to visit pewtrust.org/fiscal50. And again, we'd love to hear from you with your questions and feedback.
All right, what a great video. Good afternoon, everyone. Connecting in from Utah, I am Juliet Tennert, definitely one of the Pew Fiscal 50's biggest fans. I've used the Fiscal 50 tool for years now in a variety of roles, worked as a legislative fiscal staffer, state chief economist and budget director, and a university public finance researcher and instructor. And this tool and the team's insights have been key to me in all of those roles. And I had the pleasure of getting a little preview of the new version of the Fiscal 50 over the past couple of months and have just been so eager for this launch and for this updated version to be available publicly to all of you. And, so you've probably played with the indicator a little bit as you've been participating in this webinar, preparing for this webinar. And I'm sure like I have, you're seeing plenty of interesting dynamics in the indicators around state budget conditions and emerging fiscal risk. And so I'm super fortunate to have the first crack at asking the team about some of these dynamics. And so we'll have a little discussion with those folks that have put this amazing tool together. And then we should have some time for audience Q&A at the end of our discussion with the team. So please, as you have questions on your mind, go ahead and drop those questions into the Q&A function in WebEx. I think you should have access to them. If you're not seeing it on your screen, maybe take a look in the bottom right-hand corner, click on a little question mark icon, and you should hopefully have the ability to share questions with us. So let's just go ahead and launch right in. Would love to go to our fearless leader, Melissa Maynard first. Hi, Melissa. So I saw a post from Barrett and Green calling the Fiscal 50 supercharged, which is like completely the perfect description. So now that you've officially supercharged, can you just share a little bit on your thoughts around how do you expect that supercharged platform to continue to evolve, and what that means for us as consumers, what that looks like for your team?
It's exciting because this really feels like just the beginning. This project has involved an intense blend of tasks. So everything from thinking about how to evolve the data and methodologies for each of the indicators to the graphics and design, and then also writing and editing all of the content. And so for the team, we've been heads down on the nuts and bolts of this for so long that it's thrilling to be able to kind of come up for air and start thinking more deeply about what's ahead, especially when it comes to the ongoing content. Our goal is to start updating this platform every few weeks with timely.
Wow.
So going forward, regularly updating our core indicators may actually be a little bit easy for us in some ways than it's been in the past, and we hope to be able to improve our timeliness. One reason for that is that we've been able to automate some of the true drudgery. So I'm thinking about things like formatting downloadable data files that have just historically sucked up a lot of our ongoing time. So now that the launch is behind us, our hope is to begin devoting as much of our energy as possible to exploring emerging issues that really matter to states and to making connections between what we're seeing in the data and what we're seeing play out on the ground.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing that bit of an insight, and that kind of helps as we jump into talking with these folks on your team. I know that they're incredible, like data analysts, and behind the scenes have done a great job on that technical analysis. But I'm glad to hear that they're going to have that more space and time for that, true analysis and interpretation, because at least from what I've seen so far in working with them, they just have incredible insight and can make incredible connections that will surely be helpful, policymakers, staffers, and just generally interested people out there. So thank you. Let's go ahead and just talk to some of your team. Asha Bernacca Levestro, I'm going to come your way first because you're the lead on population analysis. And I mean, I may be biased as a former demographer, but really demographics absolutely just underpin everything that we do in the state budget world. So, I mean, state of demographics and population change is like always widely covered in the public debate nowadays. And I'm just wondering if, as you've been working on that indicator, updating that indicator, analyzing that indicator of population change, can you just provide some insight on how that indicator contributes to that conversation, what policymakers are thinking about? I'd appreciate your insight.
Sure. Well, so by now, I think we've all already heard many times that population growth is slowing nationwide for decades. And most, like you said, a lot of the research and media coverage focuses on population change in the cities in the US. So what we contribute is that 50-state perspective that is a little bit harder to come by.
Yeah.
Our population change indicator not only tells you which states lost and gained population over the long term and annually, but it also gives you that inside scoop as to why those shifts occurred. So for example, if your state is losing population, you can quickly tell if it is because people are moving out of your state, or maybe it is because births are not keeping up with deaths, or maybe it's both. Another feature of our indicator that I would like to highlight, and that I really think it's a gem among resources like ours, is that now you can compare population projections for all 50 states through 2040. And we provide these populations for the total, these projections for the total population and by age group. For example, your senior population, early childhood, working age population, and so on. So you can really get a sense of potential stressors to your budget in the coming years. And lastly, I'll just highlight to Melissa's point before that now that we're done with the redesign, we are planning to do some additional work on demographics, focusing on migration trends across states and birth rates across states.
Great, thank you. And again, I mean, those differences in migration and birth rates have implications for expectations around state revenue and expectations about expenditures. So just having that all in one place is so helpful. And then your unique insights, because you're seeing the data in a comprehensive way, are so helpful. I could ask this anywhere, but because it is particularly interesting when we're thinking about those components of population change, we have the ability now in this indicator to gain a regional perspective. So again, you've got the history, you've got the forecast, we can see the 50 states, we can compare the nation, but we can also think about how our state's dynamics in the context of our region. using this tool. Could you just, and again, we see that across all of the indicators, but could you just talk a little bit about, how that can inform our thinking?
Sure, yeah, I do agree that population is a great example for that. So, people have been gravitating from the Northeast and Midwest towards the South and West for decades now for a variety of reasons. So if you are located in the South or West and the population in your state has been growing slower than the regional median, that might be one indication of, potential risks to your state. So a good example of that is for Mississippi and West Virginia in the South. So the South has been the second fastest growing region over the past 15 years. Yet Mississippi and West Virginia both lost residents over the time period. So I think this is a pretty striking comparison that 2 out of only 3 states nationwide that had population losses over this time period are located in a region that generally is growing really fast. And we know that it's not always ideal to compare your state to the census region, and that's how we define our regions. There are census designated regions. So what you can also do in our interactive is pick any group of peer states. So depending on your economic makeup, you may want to compare your state to others that are reliant on tourism or with aging populations or energy states or whatever your criteria might be to get those great insights in how your state is faring compared to its peers.
Great. Thank you for making that point and highlighting that capability, because again, that particular lens is so instructive when we're thinking about the challenges to state budgets. All right, well, we'll go on, and again, we could spend all day talking about any of these indicators. Let's go on and talk a little bit about tax revenue. Alexandre Fall, I'll come your way among some of the other indicators. I know that you're a lead on the tax revenue indicator. And again, as I was looking at this early on, I was excited to see that you've made some pretty significant updates to this indicator that is quite central. I mean, tax revenue is quite central to all we do. I hope that you can share with our audience a little bit more about the changes that you've made and maybe even some of the reasoning behind it would be helpful.
Hey, Juliet, nice to speak with you today. Thanks for asking that question. So we shifted some of our focus for our tax revenue indicator from point in time comparisons to more of a long-term perspective. And with our updated indicator, we now compare current revenue levels to a 15-year trajectory. And we think this provides a sort of long-term framing, a little more long-term than in previous years. And we think by putting present conditions in a more historical context, we can provide insights into states' long-term financial well-being, and then we can encourage states to look a little beyond the current budget cycle. Also, like comparing current revenue levels to a long-term perspective can show how far you are from this long-term trajectory, and understanding if I've deviated from the long-term trend. You can start to ask, is this due to temporary factors or something that's more recurring? And so we are starting to ask those questions ourselves, but also hoping that our audiences will ask those questions as well. And in the past, we compared tax revenue collections to pre-pandemic levels, and even before that to the Great Recession. And while those perspectives will always be very valuable and near and dear to our hearts just because we worked on them for so long, the longer and longer we move away from those shocks, the less valuable those point in time perspectives are. So by focusing on long-term trajectories, we can put more of an emphasis on broader patterns and underlying trends, which we think is very valuable.
Great. Well, thanks. A great insight, of course, and then just again, great information that you're providing through the tool, and appreciate that enhancement. As you mentioned, I think that we're all thinking about this, or should be thinking about it, and so you're providing that additional insight and an actual in a concrete way to start looking at this for your own state and then across states. And so thank you for sharing that with us, and I'm sure that our users will be excited to take a closer look. Well, again, it pains me that I can't keep asking questions, but why don't we just go ahead and pivot a little bit. Justin Thiel, he cover revenue along with Alexandre, revenue volatility, major expenditures, It's nice to have that enhancement of being able to think about the current picture in the context of the long-term trend and what that means for like dynamics around changes. Are they short-term dynamics? Are they longer-term dynamics? And so you have this nice view of the big picture of what's going on. I hope that maybe you could just hear a little bit about what these update or indicators are telling us about that broader revenue picture.
Definitely, and thanks, Juliet. So thinking big picture, Pew's updated fiscal 50 indicators, I think really highlight two major revenue risks that policymakers are grappling with these days. The first is weakening tax collections, and the second is the phase out of historic but temporary federal pandemic funds. So thinking about tax revenue, the revamped tax revenue trends indicator provides probably one of my favorite new and striking visuals of the new platform. And as Alexandre alluded to, the analysis measures how current tax revenue levels compare with their long-term trends, both total collections as well as individual tax sources. And it really shows that tax collections were 15% above their long-term trend at its peak in 2022. And then it's been on a downward trajectory ever since. And nearly half of states are actually underperforming their long-term trends right now. And just as a side note, before I touch on federal funds, it's not inherently bad whether a state's tax revenue is above or below its trend level. It is crucial, though, that policymakers understand why their tax collections are deviating from their trend. And for instance, questions that might be interesting for policymakers to understand is, are these differences simply the reflection of a policy change that we enacted? Or are they the result of other forces beyond their control, like demographic shifts that you mentioned earlier? And then, of course, it's important to know whether these are likely one-time deviations or they're due to ongoing factors. And so I mentioned federal funds before. That other crucial
I was going to
aspects.
prompt you on that. You piqued my interest when you mentioned federal funds.
The big thing recently. One of the many big things recently, federal funds that flow directly to state governments has been the other crucial aspect of the big revenue picture these days. And in the federal share of state revenue indicator, you can really see how the portion of state budgets, excuse me, funded by federal aid after it spiked after the pandemic's onset, reaching an all-time high of 37% in 2021.
Yeah.
And the important thing to note here, right, is that these federal pandemic funds were historic but temporary, and it's been almost 4 years. So many of the largest forms of federal pandemic aid are already expired or set to expire soon. So all in all, between these two indicators, tax revenue trends and federal funds, they can really paint a clear picture of the trends that lawmakers are navigating these days.
Great, thank you. And I mean, again, questions, if the audience has any questions that are coming to mind, please do drop that in the Q&A. We've got some good ones going there, but I'm certain there are many out there. Justin, maybe, again, I'd love to talk even more about federal funds, but I have the tool now. I can go dig into the tool and get your insights there online after we close up. I wonder if you could also just acknowledging we're don't have a lot of time. I wonder if you could touch just on the spending picture. I know you've got like a Medicaid indicator, maybe. So what are you drawing from the indicator on the spending side?
Right. So just on the spending side of the ledger, I mean, one of the biggest takeaways is just that despite those revenue declines that I talked about before, state spending has continued to rise due to a couple of big factors, including that the phase out of federal funds, but also rising wages for public employees, elevated inflation still, the growing costs of long-term liabilities like pensions and debt. But as you said, the revamped state Medicaid spending indicator is one that speaks directly to a lot of these increased spending pressures that states are facing these days. And that indicator looks broadly at how much of states' own money goes to pay for the healthcare program and compares that amount to the state's long-term average. And that's really meant to provide a sense of whether Medicaid's burden on state budgets is growing or shrinking compared to the state's norm. And part of the analysis that we highlight is how the pandemic era surge in tax revenue and the additional federal pandemic aid that came through really led to this decrease in the amount of state funds that had to go to Medicaid.
Yeah.
But federal, a lot of this aid is phasing out quickly, and a lot
Yeah.
of the key cost factors, like Medicaid enrollment, remain near record highs still. So the pressure on state budgets is expected to spike, very much like the spike in state funds going to Medicaid after similar federal aid expired following the Great Recession about a decade ago.
That's great. Thank you. And again, we can all get more information about what that looks like for our specific states, for groups of states, for the nation as a whole through this tool. So thank you. Let's pop on over to Paige. Paige Forrest, you cover fiscal balance and reserves. Let's talk rainy day funds, something that is very near and dear to my former budget director's heart. So looking at the indicator, I can see that rainy day fund balances are sitting at near record highs. And my opinion on this is that we see a result like that thanks in part to a lot of the work and support of Pew over the past decade. So wasn't surprised to see that. But then as I was looking at the data and reading your analysis, I noticed that you mentioned that states are actually projecting declines in those reserves through the end of 2024. Could you tell us a little bit more about this? Is this a sign of tighter times to come?
Hi, Julia. Thanks so much. That's a great question. As Justin just highlighted, policymakers are facing several looming challenges ahead. The good news for states is that as of estimated fiscal year 2023 numbers, rainy day funds are at an all-time high in their capacity for the number of days that a state could cover with their rainy day funds alone. That trend continues looking ahead to the close of fiscal year 2024. However, the bad news, as you highlighted, becomes more apparent when we look over at states' ending balances. Now, ending balances, as you know, are the unappropriated or leftover budget dollars available at the end of the year. And these ending balances are projected to decline at a drastically sharper rate than we've seen in previous years. Because of their flexibility, they're often the first to go in a fiscal pinch. So when ending balances start to decline like this, especially combined with the declining tax revenue that Justin highlighted, it could signal potentially tighter times for state budgets ahead.
Great. Thank you. And again, I'll just repeat my my line of more information on the Fiscal 50s website. Thank you, Paige. Let's go ahead and go to Riley. Riley, you're overseeing some very informative indicators around long-term liabilities. So pensions, retiree healthcare, debt. And when I was beginning my career and then leading up into the Great Recession, the big storyline, I can even remember on, Friday night 2020 news, the big storyline was around just this impending disaster of state pensions and just pressure around long-term liabilities. But then we kind of move into the last decade and we've seen states making a lot of improvement, especially towards pension. And again, in my personal opinion, due in part from the great support and research of Pew Charitable Trust. But we've got to keep an eye on these things. You provide great information through the indicators. Can you tell us, yes, that was the big storyline then. What are some potential storylines, or what's the big storyline maybe to be taking out of what you're seeing in those indicators now?
Hi, Julia. That's a great question. Thank you. So as you mentioned, states have made progress in funding their pensions, but pensions are still a significant liability that way on state finances. In fiscal 2021, which is the most recent year we have of data, unfunded pension benefits were equal to nearly half of states' share of collective own source revenue.
Wow.
And we've seen since 2007 that unfunded liability has increased as a share of states' own source revenue by 14.4 percentage points. But as you mentioned, over the 15-year period that we measure, there has been some variation in that trend. So from 2007 to 2016, the unfunded pension benefits were steadily rising as a share of states' own source revenue. And then since 2016, they've generally declined, except for the years in 2020 or of 2019 and 2020. We're seeing that in 2021, there were record stock market returns. And as you mentioned, this substantial increase in state employer and employee contributions that really allowed state pension funds to collectively narrow the gap between the amount that they set aside and the amount that they owed in benefits. This is a really important development in how states are managing pension funds, which are a very significant unfunded liability for states. Our indicator also looks at unfunded retiree healthcare liabilities as well as debt, so I can touch on those as well. So unfunded retiree healthcare from 2007 to, 2008 to 2019 declined overall as a share of states' combined own source revenue. But a significant thing to note is that during this time period, there was actually a rise in states' own source revenue that contributed to that overall decline of as a share of own source revenue. So that was really kind of driving that factor. And a lot of the growth that we were seeing generally is hard to pinpoint with unfunded retiree healthcare promises. Now, when we're looking at debt, which is typically the smaller of the three unfunded liabilities that we look at, it's important to note that we focus on debt that states are directly responsible for, so things such as general obligation bonds, and we also exclude debt that has designated revenue streams, such as from toll roads or stadiums. Yeah. So when we're looking at the 50 states, there's been a decline in outstanding debt from that time period of 2008 to 2021. However, it's important to note, like with retiree healthcare benefits, that debt has actually increased in dollar terms during this time period, and that increase in states' own source revenue was driving the overall share down. And you can see all of these different trends in our long-term liabilities indicator, which provides a really great visual for that.
Yeah, thanks, Riley, for covering all of that. And like you said, you can see it in the indicator, and that's why sometimes interesting, you see this general trend of percent of expenditures, but your tool allows us to dig down deeper and look at what those actual levels look like, and again, what the patterns look like. So thank you. So let's wrap up this conversation with the team with Liz Farmer, and it's maybe a nice segue because there's a lot of storylines that Riley's just alluded to. Liz is new to the Pew team, but surely a very well-known name for many of our attendees as a veteran journalist on state fiscal policy. And so, first of all, Liz, I'm so thrilled that you're engaged directly in this work. And second of all, I would just love, as we wrap up this conversation with the team, to hear your insights on, how this all comes together, how this information can be used, that journalist perspective I'd love to hear.
Oh, yeah. I mean, something I was thinking about as my colleagues were talking is that whenever I am at conferences or speaking with people, with stakeholders and folks in different states, I mean, the one thing I think a lot of policymakers crave is that 30,000-foot view that they really don't get because everyone's kind of dug into whatever they're working on. And I think one of the biggest things that the new Fiscal 50 does is it provides that. It not only provides that story, the stories and the content, but it shows how the data is playing out in the real world. And as a journalist too, I mean, I've used the old Fiscal 50 website. I think the new one tells so many more stories than the old one did. I mean, just by playing with the data. And so there's a real ability there to see, there's a real ability there for people to see how this looks like out in the real world and to answer so many more questions as well.
That's great. Well, again, thanks for lending that perspective. So glad you're part of the team. and what a great team to be part of. I'm so glad that we've got time for those audience questions, and I see that there are questions coming in. Again, please go ahead and drop any questions that you have into that Q&A function. The Pew team has told me that while we won't be able to get to every question here, they've told me that they will follow up directly to you if they aren't able to answer your question live here during the webinar. And maybe what I'll do is I will start off, it seems like there's a couple of just kind of technical functional questions here, I guess. I'd maybe label them. There's a question around if Pew foresees adding U.S. territories to the data set in the future. Perhaps maybe Justin or Melissa, you could speak to that.
I can start maybe, and Justin, you can fill in some of the details. I would just say we've struggled with this honestly over time. Our name is Fiscal 50, so there's some awkwardness to trying to be Fiscal 50 plus the territories, but many of us are DC residents. We're interested in territories, and that's something that we should continue to consider. One of the biggest factors is that for our indicators, there are data limitations in trying to assess the territories. Justin, would you mind speaking to one or two of the specifics on that?
Sure. I mean, of the indicators that I work on personally, Medicaid is a big one. Tax revenue is another core one. Reserves is obviously key to the state finances and has limitations when it comes to rainy day fund balances and other ending balances. I would point out that the National Association of State Budget Officers just released another report that they'll be partnered with regularly on budget processes that territories use. So that might be a good resource for those interested in learning more about territorial budget processes.
Great. All right. Well, thanks, Justin and Melissa. And then a couple of, again, just maybe we'll just lump these kind of technical questions together before turning over to a bit of content. I have someone who's mentioning that I don't know if this is really a question, but they're mentioning they like the responsive captions. So I do too. So maybe I'll take a moderator's prerogative and ask about those. And then there also is a question just around how do I actually access this tool? And so I don't know, maybe Melissa, could you make sure that everyone knows where to find this tool? And then I would just, again, love to hear about a little bit more about these responsive captions in the tool.
Sure. So pewtrust.org/fiscal50 is how you access the tool. And we would love for you to bookmark your state page and come back to it regularly. There's a way to sign up for our newsletter and regular updates on that page as well. And I would just say that the responsive captions were really exciting part of the site's architecture to us. As I was saying earlier, we had to do a lot of heavy lifting to kind of draft the captions in a really specific way, but it's almost like a calculator for words, because we can kind of send one version if the data is above the national median, and a different version if it's below the national median, but we have complete control. So the process of crafting those in a way that it's exactly right, and working with our design and development partner Graphicacy to kind of create this new language that would allow us to do this was really an intense and exciting part of the process. And now that we have this language, we're really excited to use it for ongoing work, and to make our ongoing work of drafting new captions as there are updates that continue to make sense and adapt where they need to adapt is really exciting for us.
Really excellent. Well, thank you. So we've got kind of just, it looks like just some questions about the indicators themselves, and what better chance to have a direct access to the team. Let's see, it looks like there's a question here around just kind of variation in state tax revenue. NASBO published a report saying that tax revenue increased in 2023, but you say that state tax revenue declined pretty significantly. Why is there this difference? Maybe it's unfair to throw that one at you, but it is kind of, there's some interesting dynamics that I know are going on. Maybe Alexandre, could you speak to that question?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. That is an interesting question. So NASBA, as well as a lot of state budget offices, take a nominal perspective on tax revenues, just comparing like holistic levels to the year before, and then we make a inflation adjustment. So we try to take into consideration price increases just so that
Oh, okay.
you could potentially, you could be gaining more revenues, but then your ability to afford things goes down. So kind of the purchasing power of states has declined in recent years. And also, I think in nominal terms, state tax collection levels are also beginning to descend. So
Great.
that
Okay.
explains
Yeah.
that difference.
Okay, thank you. Well, hopefully that answers that person's question. And I'll just make the point from someone who consumes all of this information, what great like complementary tools are out there from partners like NASBO and then of course Pew and NCSL, and just tells us again, there are different tools for different reasons, and we can, it's just good to have those additional lenses. And Alexandre's provided a good explanation of this particular difference, and also a good explanation around this dynamic that we should be thinking about, inflation and purchasing power, as we're thinking about state budgeting. Let's see. It's kind of fun to be able to pick and choose. Oh, here's a general one. What types of emerging risk are you all paying most attention to? Gosh, maybe we throw that one to Justin.
Yeah, that sounds like what keeps me up at night a little bit. So
I'm throwing it your way because I never even thought of thinking a lot about this.
yeah, so a few risks, right, stand out beyond the sort of bread and butter tax collections and spending pressures. I would say the first up is demographic shifts that we've talked a little bit about today. And that, in that sense, I'm thinking about baby boomers, for example, aging out of the workforce, declining fertility rates, and slowing immigration. These are trends that are going to vary by state, but the impact is widespread. And policymakers really need to grasp that these changes will affect their economies and their finances, both on the spending side and the revenue side. I would also say that sort of rapidly advancing technologies are a big risk on the horizon. Take electric vehicles, for instance. These innovations, have great opportunity or great opportunity for economic growth, but they can really shake up state budgets. Existing revenue streams like gas taxes might dry up, and that could really, increase this need for new types of spending as well on the spending side of the ledger. And last, and definitely not least, I would say the impacts of a changing climate, they cannot be ignored. We're talking about more frequent and severe natural disasters, increasing threats from extreme heat and rising sea levels, and all of the economic and fiscal disruptions that come with those things.
Great, thank you. Great answer, and hopefully to the person who asked that question, helpful. And then also to the person who asked that question, be interested to hear what you think about emerging risk as you're looking through the Fiscal 50 information, and also all of Pew's fiscal health analysis and research. There's a question around population. Asha, I'll ask you this. It's just, what can a state with population decline do about it? So we have the data that shows population decline in certain states. What's the state to do?
Well, that is $1 million question for sure.
Yeah, come on, just to put you on the spot,
We are seeing different initiatives that states take, that states with declining or slow growing population. So some states do things like provide financial incentives to attract people to move there. So for example, there are fiscal financial incentives for recent graduates or for remote workers. I'm not sure how well this is working. Like some states, some folks in New York are thinking about putting together a committee that would investigate why people are leaving New York and trying to remedy it, things like that. But what I would like to offer a different perspective here too, because it's not only states with declining populations that are facing challenges, it's also states where populations are growing really rapidly. they may, find it difficult to handle. And we've seen that during the pandemic, like in 2020, 2021, when some states, especially in the West, had this massive growth in people basically overnight. And we know that they did find it difficult to respond to this very rapid demand for services like housing and infrastructure and healthcare and so forth. So while events like the pandemic hopefully is not very frequent, Pew generally recommends that states look at their finances in the long term, and we have the data to show the trends in states. So some states do that already. They conduct a long-term budget assessment, which is like a study that basically projects revenue and expenses many years into the future to figure out whether states are on a fiscally sustainable path, or it helps them pinpoint their kind of like weak points that they can respond to in advance.
Great. All right. Great. Thank you. Great answer. I think a journalist must have written this one. What are some of the policy developments that the team will be following this year? Upcoming topics in or ESG legislation. And so we'll go to Liz. Maybe Liz is well suited to talk about those policy developments that we can expect to gain insights from the Fiscal 50 on.
Sure. So I can preview some of the things we'll be looking at in our budget threads feature, which is sort of the main vehicle for us, for not just people in the Fiscal 50 team, but all across the state fiscal health crew here at Pew. The budget threads feature is essentially our way of kind of pulling from this current events and showing people, what kind of drawing it back to policy or drawing it back to the data. So with ESG, we will have something coming up in a little bit on ESG legislation, both approaches in states that that look at ESG positively and approaches in states that look at ESG as a negative to their state economy. So we'll be looking at that. And again, kind of just drawing it back to that investment officer perspective and some other topics that we'll be looking at. The federal wind down, Justin mentioned this earlier, and I think this is a great illustration of how those current events, how the data and the things that we're tracking sort of look like out there in the real world. So something that we'll be looking at a little bit later is the wind down of the education dollars and how that's playing out in public schools and what policymakers are doing and how they're thinking about it.
Great, thank you. And again, just emphasizing, we have access to the data in a comprehensive way through the tools, and then on top of it, we have all of that incredible insight and interpretation to look out for. There's a question here about Medicaid. What factors are driving the overall rise in state Medicaid spending, and do you expect that trend to continue into the future? Who best would be suited for this? Maybe Riley, can you take that one on? If not, maybe Justin.
Absolutely, I can take it on.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely. So what we're seeing with Medicaid is, as Justin mentioned, there's this wind down of federal Medicaid, increased federal aid during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as that's starting to unwind, we're expecting that in fiscal 24 and 2025, state Medicaid spending is going to continue to grow as states are required to dedicate more resources to Medicaid. We're also seeing factors that are also exerting some upward pressure on state Medicaid spending, including rising prescription drug prices, increases in healthcare provider payment rates. But at the same time, we're also expecting that that temporary surge in Medicaid enrollment that we saw during the pandemic, that is starting to decline in fiscal year 2024 and 2025. So we have these kind of two joint forces that are working together. But generally, we are expecting a rise in state Medicaid spending in the upcoming years.
All right. Well, thank you. I'm seeing lots of good questions in the chat. Unfortunately, we pretty much are at time. And so again, I will just reiterate to all the attendees that the Pew team has committed to following up with you individually on any questions that we were not able to answer. I should also make sure that you know that we will be circulating a recording of this webinar when it's over. And if you need to specifically request it, like you haven't gotten it, please go ahead and email can@pewtrust.org. So I'll just go ahead and wrap everything up. To the Fiscal 50 team, thank you, thank you, thank you. I hope that you feel great about the launch of the tool, that you get some rest and then come back with those big brains to continue to share all of the incredible analysis that you do. And just again, thank you for involving me. And I hope that everyone attending gets a chance to take some time this afternoon to check out the Fiscal 50. And we'll go ahead and sign off and say goodbye and have a great afternoon.